Because it's a war that ravaged for 39 days and has now come to a halt, with the US and Iran announcing a 2-week ceasefire. On the one hand, the United States has agreed to Iran's 10-point plan. On the other, Iran has made it clear that its hands remain on the trigger, and any misstep will be met with force. But tensions are far from over. Israel has drawn a red line over Lebanon. In the last few hours, the Israel military has carried out one of its largest waves of airstrikes, targeting Hezbollah command centers and military sites within minutes. In response, Iran says it now has enough reason to cancel talks with the United States, even calling off its peace talks outreach. At the heart of it all lies a big question. Will this ceasefire hold, or is it already on the brink of collapse? With the news of the ceasefire coming in, what can we expect in coming days, over the next 2 weeks in particular, which are going to be very crucial? Joining us at the moment is Wes J. Bryant. He's a former war analyst with the Pentagon. Thank you so much, Mr. Bryant, for joining us. And let me begin by asking you, is this yet another attempt of, or another example of a TACO, as it's being called now, Trump chickening out? We've seen several U-turns in the past. In this case, of course, he was threatening to wipe out an entire civilization. How do you look at this? Was there an urgent need for an exit ramp as far as Trump is concerned? And what has driven this decision?
You know, you're exactly right. It's incredibly disturbing, I think, to say the least. What Trump and this administration have already done militarily, globally, let alone in Iran. You know, we have illegal acts of war. We have war crimes that have been committed by the U.S. and jointly by the U.S. and Israel. And now we have a president that's threatening, you know, literal genocide. I can heads somewhere within the administration or our U.S. military leadership had some effect on Trump and saying, you know, we need to de-escalate what you've initiated here. We do not need to initiate this mass bombing campaign on civilian infrastructure in Iran, as you have been threatening. So I have to believe that it's for that reason that we're seeing this back down and this de-escalation. You know, you mentioned the TACO acronym or you know, insult that's been thrown at Trump, and you know, frankly, TACO or not, I'm just glad that for now the potential for atrocity has been at least stopped or at least delayed. You know, regardless of whether or not it's because Trump is chickening out or backing down. I really think at this point, the U.S. needs to avoid, you know, what we call the sunk cost fallacy, and just cut losses and reinitiate diplomatic proceedings with Iran and really stop all military hostilities.
Right. Now, this is one war where the goal has repeatedly changed. We were first told about regime change, then we were talking about the nuclear weapons program being eliminated and so on and so forth. But at this point of time, with the Strait of Hormuz that is now, you know, going to be controlled by Iran, they're going to be charging a fee for the ships as per the plan that has been, the 10-point plan that they have in fact put in place. Isn't this at some level or the other a strategic victory for Iran in terms of what they've been able to achieve?
You know, this is absolutely a strategic victory. If the U.S., if the Trump administration has indeed agreed to this entire 10-point plan, and one of those, you know, a couple of those points being lifting of sanctions, and then Iran's control of the strait and ability to charge and make even more revenue, you know, they're in a better spot other than the bombings that they've endured and, of course, the civilian harm, civilian casualties that they've endured at the hands of U.S. and Israel. They are in a better spot now than they were even before this war was initiated. So that's the incredibly ironic and really shameful part of this whole situation.
Right. The big question was, of course, the kind of retaliation that we saw. Was there an underestimation in terms of how the retaliation could be from Iran's side? Because right until the end, right until last week, we saw them take down an F-15E, for instance. And is this a war the U.S. could have ever won? Because Iran certainly is not Iraq. It has more geographical challenges. It has a huge military in terms of its infrastructure, in terms of its supply and stock of arms, etc., and has been preparing for this defense ever since the U.S. scorched the earth back in 2003.
Yes, there was a fundamental, really, underestimation here and overconfidence on part of the administration and on part of our military leadership. One of the fundamental tenets that we certainly learned through the war on terror from modern warfare is wars are not won with airstrikes, with bombing campaigns alone. I can attest to that. I was one of the ones coordinating and controlling airstrikes. And that's not the only thing that enabled victory. I'll cite the war against ISIS. There were a whole lot of other factors that enabled victory against the ISIS caliphate, dismantling the caliphate. And, frankly, the ISIS caliphate, the Iraq regime, the Taliban, they all kind of pale in comparison to the Iranian regime and military forces. Yes, we've attrited a whole lot of their military forces, but they've got a standing military nearing 1 million people, right? And clearly, as we can see, we have not defeated their ballistic missile, their drone capability. We haven't defeated their high-end surface to air, their air defense capability, because I can tell you it takes a higher-end system, not just anti-aircraft artillery or a rocket-propelled grenade. It takes a higher-end system to bring down an aircraft like an F-15. And we've seen they've shot down, our F-15s, potentially an A-10 as well, after that in recent weeks. And so, we see this level of propaganda from the Trump administration about winning and dominance, but, I'd really like to know what is the measurement, what is the scale for winning or victory. If it means, the most airstrikes, then I suppose that's a win, but that's just preposterous.
Right. Now, you've been heard calling President Trump and Hegseth as maniacal. Have you personally interacted with them? What is your biggest cause of worry with the two of them at the helm? And, of course, what we've seen over the last 5.5 weeks?
Yes, they're certainly maniacal. Sadly, if you look at their rhetoric and their actions, the Iranian regime has exercised more restraint, more professionalism, more adherence to international law than our own leadership, than our president in the United States, and our Secretary of War, as he calls himself. An utter dehumanization of entire population, an utter recklessness, this illegal campaign aside, a recklessness in the conduct of the war, where we're hitting civilians and civilian infrastructure en masse right now, importing the practices of the Israeli military, which has been carrying out atrocity and genocide in Gaza and other atrocities across the Middle East. So, absolutely, there's no other word other than maniacal for a president who threatens to destroy an entire civilization in one night.
Right. Now, at the Pentagon, you used to be the chief of civilian harm, Mr. Bryant. Now, this department was cut to size. What do you think went wrong here? And do you think that that's why the entire Minab tragedy happened in the first place? Because people who could have prevented it were no longer kept around.
Certainly if the office I was a part of, the Civilian Protection Center of Excellence, and what we call the Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response enterprise within the DoD, certainly if that had continued to exist, if it still had the momentum that we were carrying through, I don't believe something like the Madhavdas here. However, I'll also say that, even in absence of the organization I was a part of at the Pentagon, this new organization to help robustify our methods for protecting civilians, even in absence of that, the Manab school strike, the strike campaign in general, the massive amount of civilian harm we've seen outside of just that school strike, and even strikes previous throughout this last year in the Pacific and Caribbean, in Yemen, they're all severe detractions from the doctrine and standards that the U.S. has established for the last 2-3 decades plus. So, complete detractions, complete failures to follow basic targeting doctrine, basic standards in civilian harm mitigation that we've already had in place. That's the most concerning aspect here. And that's really a symptom of someone like Pete Hegseth, at the helm of the Department of Defense.
Right. Now, there was a lot of commentary behind the sacking of bureaucrats in the U.S., but the most shocking of them all was the firing of the Army Chief of Staff, General Randy George, in the middle of the war. And the commentary went that forget regime change in Iran, but it definitely happened in the United States. What do you make of this episode?
We've seen more firings of senior leaders, of general officers by Hegseth in the last, I believe it's the last 150 years of the U.S. military's existence. That is just incredibly alarming. And so, clearly there was something happening behind the scenes where the Army Chief of Staff was standing up. I mean, I would hope anyway. And I believe that's the case with really every other one of the firings. Either these people fell under, his construct of, quote, woke, and or they were standing up to the pure fascism that he's trying to institute at the Department of Defense, and that he is carrying out on part of really an authoritarian and a tyrant, a modern imperialist in Donald Trump. And so I think we're going to see more firings. I would hope that the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff and General Kane stand up to Hegseth. And frankly, we're at the point where we might actually need an armed coup or some kind of soft coup in the United States.
That's pretty big.
Because, yes, indeed.
And how do you propose that will happen? Because while there are those who've obviously asked for the impeachment of the president, etc., actually executing it becomes very difficult because the cabinet, the ministers, the secretaries are all pretty loyal to Donald Trump.
Yes, absolutely. I hope that articles of impeachment are immediately put forth. I mean, they should have already before even the Iran war. But I don't have hope that they'll have any success until potentially November. And that's just incredibly unfortunate. The complicity in this administration across the Republican Party is just frankly astounding. When Trump said in his first term that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and that his supporters would still back him, that was one of the few truths that he has stated, and that was a severe understatement. And we're seeing all of that play out. And no matter what he does, he will be backed by his supporters who are truly to the level of a cult at this point.
Right.
I mean, this regime, this administration is really no different than the radical form of Islamicism, the jihadists that we have been waging war against in various capacities in the war on terror. These are frankly Christian jihadists that have taken hold of our government.
That's a very, very strong use of phrases over there. But as someone who's worked in the Pentagon, do you get a sense that it has turned increasingly into a political space as opposed to being, a professional force that should be occupying that building?
Absolutely. Our governments and even our military at the senior levels in the Pentagon should have a healthy level of dissension, of disagreement. We should have generals that are pushing back at a Secretary of Defense and vice versa. And, we've lost that completely. We have really a Secretary of Defense, or War, again, as he calls himself, who's conducting himself like a five-star general. But even more concerning, like a maniacal five-star general, a completely warmongering five-star general. I mean, beyond some of the worst warmongers in history, frankly.
Right. I also wanted to ask you about the kind of developments that are taking place. We have already heard about how Iran had said that they would be charging a certain fee and that ships would actually be allowed to cross the Strait of Hormuz. But when it comes to Lebanon, given the fact that Israel hasn't agreed to stop the fighting there in Lebanon, now we are told that movement of ships, even in the Strait of Hormuz, has been halted. Do you see this as being a huge challenge in coming days in terms of actually executing the peace plan? Because it appears to be only being implemented in fits and starts, because there are certainly areas where it's not being implemented at the moment.
I do see it as a huge challenge. I mean, I understand Iran's position, of course, there as well. Israel should stop its bombing campaign in Lebanon as a part of this ceasefire. And, you know, the unfortunate thing here is Trump, and we know how sensitive and emotional he is. He conducts himself off of emotion quite often. You know, there's a lot of talk already. There's word from, you know, insiders in the Trump administration that they're trying to quell him and ease him in this news that he's already seeing about Iran getting a strategic win here. And so them not only opening the strait might well be his excuse to initiate the bombing campaign that he may want to now initiate again once he gets that slight, that insult of being told that he won and Iran lost here.
You've actually mentioned to another channel the danger here, and you've called it an incredible danger, is that the U.S. military is starting to import the practices of the Israeli military. What makes you say this?
Right. You know, a recklessness in carrying out strike campaigns. You know, we've seen, I'll go back to the spring campaign last year in Yemen, and then this campaign in Iran, where we've got a marked increase in strikes against civilian infrastructure, in reports and verified reports of civilian casualties, even children. An incredible increase, an incredible departure from what we had worked towards as a military force in our operations in recent years. And we're also seeing a reluctance to even acknowledge this or even care or apologize for any civilian casualties, whether inadvertent or not.
Right.
And now we're seeing justifications for hitting civilian infrastructure beyond what I ever experienced in U.S. military targeting operations, where, you know, even our U.S. military leadership is coming back and saying how they're justifying potentially hitting all of Iran's energy infrastructure. Something I'd never thought I'd see evolve in the U.S. military. At this point, you know, international law doesn't really exist. What exists is whatever the Trump administration and, in this case, Israeli administration want to do and carry out and state as legal. But the bottom line is, yes, a massive increase in civilian harm and dehumanizing entire populations.
All right. Wes Bryant, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time out and speaking to us here at Times Now.
Thank you.